In the spring of 1945, a man in a white lab coat walked out of a German rocket facility and raised his hands in surrender. His name was Wernher von Braun. He was 33 years old. He was a member of the Nazi Party. He held the rank of SS Major, and in his briefcase were the technical documents for the most advanced rocket program the world had ever seen. The American soldiers who accepted his surrender did not arrest him. They gave him a desk. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this one, consider subscribing. Without further ado, let us get into it. The year is 1945. The Second World War is ending, and the United States government is facing a problem that nobody wanted to say out loud. The Nazis had won the science race, not the war. The war was lost, and Germany lay in ruins. But inside those ruins, buried in mountain facilities and hidden underground factories, were scientific achievements that American researchers had not come close to matching. Rocket technology, chemical weapons, aviation medicine, nerve agents, biological research. Entire fields where German scientists were a decade or more ahead of anything the Allies had produced. And those scientists were now standing in the rubble of a defeated nation, stateless, unemployed, and available. What happened next was not an accident. It was not improvised. It was a deliberate, carefully organized, officially sanctioned program run at the highest levels of the United States government. It was called Operation Paperclip. The name came from the paperclips used to attach new biographical summaries to the personnel files of recruited scientists. Summaries that replaced the original files. Files that contained inconvenient details. Membership in the Nazi Party. Involvement in weapons programs that used slave labor from concentration camps. Signatures on documents authorizing the use of human beings as test subjects. Those details were not merely overlooked, they were actively removed. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the body overseeing the operation, had a specific directive. Scientists whose records contained material that would make them ineligible for entry to the United States were to have that material reviewed. Reviewed, in practice, meant sanitized. The State Department had strict rules about who could enter the country. The military had scientists it needed, and so the rules were quietly bent, the files quietly altered, and the men quietly imported. Over 1,600 of them. Wernher von Braun was the most famous. He had designed the V-2 rocket, the weapon that rained down on London and Antwerp in the final years of the war, killing thousands of civilians. The V-2 was built at an underground factory called Mittelwerk, using slave laborers from the Dora concentration camp. Historians estimate that more people died building the V-2 than were ever killed by the weapon itself. The laborers worked in conditions that were designed to consume them. When they could no longer work, they were executed. Von Braun knew. The evidence that he knew, that he visited the Mittelwerk, that he requested slave laborers from the SS by name, that he was present when decisions were made that led directly to deaths, was documented. That documentation was reviewed by American intelligence officers in 1945, and then his file was paperclipped with a new summary. By 1950, Wernher von Braun was working for the United States Army at Fort Bliss in Texas. By 1960, he was directing the development of the Saturn V rocket for NASA. In 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon, the rocket that got him there was built under the direction of a man who had used concentration camp prisoners to build weapons for Adolf Hitler. The moon landing was real. The history behind it was complicated in ways that were never discussed in the broadcast. But von Braun was not the only one. Arthur Rudolph had been the operations director at Mittelwerk. He personally oversaw the use of slave labor. After the war, his record was reviewed, his file was paperclipped, and he was brought to America, where he eventually became project director for the Saturn V rocket program alongside von Braun. He was not exposed until 1984, when investigators finally pieced together enough evidence to confront him. Rather than face prosecution, he renounced his American citizenship and returned to Germany. Kurt Blome had been a senior figure in the Nazi biological weapons program. There is credible evidence he conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners. He was arrested after the war and put on trial at Nuremberg. He was acquitted on a technicality. Within 2 years, he was working for the United States Army Chemical Corps, consulting on biological weapons research. Walter Schreiber had been the Surgeon General of the German Army. Evidence connected him to human medical experiments conducted on prisoners. He was brought to the United States, worked with American military medical researchers, and when a journalist in 1952 began investigating his background and published what she found, the Air Force quietly flew him to Argentina rather than allow him to face the scrutiny. These were not edge cases. They were the program. President Truman had signed a directive in 1945 explicitly barring anyone who had been more than a nominal participant in Nazi activities from being brought to America. That directive was classified, and then it was ignored. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency simply did not report the full backgrounds of the scientists they were recruiting. The directive existed on paper. The program continued in reality. The official justification was the Soviet Union. The Cold War was beginning. The Soviets were running their own version of the same program, recruiting German scientists from their occupation zone with equal aggression. The United States government made a calculation, a cold, explicit calculation, that the strategic value of these scientists outweighed the moral cost of bringing them in, that the alternative, allowing Soviet science to benefit from German expertise while American science did not, was worse than the compromise being made. It is worth sitting with that calculation for a moment, because it was not made in secret by rogue elements of a corrupt administration. It was made deliberately, at the highest levels, by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The records that were later declassified make this clear. The decision-makers knew what these men had done. They chose to proceed anyway. The program was not publicly acknowledged for decades. When journalists and historians began piecing together what had happened in the 1970s and 1980s, the initial response from government agencies was denial, then partial acknowledgement, then a slow, reluctant release of documents as classification periods expired. The full declassification of Operation Paperclip records began in earnest in the 1990s. What those records revealed matched and in many cases exceeded what investigators had suspected. The sanitization of files had been systematic. The knowledge of what was being sanitized had been widespread. The operation had been run not by a small group of rogue officers, but by an organized institutional effort with authorization from the very top. In 2020, the National Security Archive published a collection of newly available documents. Among them were internal communications from 1947, in which intelligence officers explicitly discussed the problem of scientists whose Nazi records were too severe to be easily explained away, and debated how to handle the paperwork. The paperwork. Not the men, the paperwork. Wernher von Braun died in 1977. He received a Presidential Medal for his contributions to American space exploration. His obituaries described him as a visionary. Most of them did not mention the Dora concentration camp. Arthur Rudolph's American citizenship was revoked in 1984. The investigation that exposed him was conducted by the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations. The office was created specifically to find Nazi war criminals who had entered the United States after the war. Its existence was itself an acknowledgement that the vetting process had failed, or more precisely, had never really been intended to succeed. What Operation Paperclip tells us is not simply that the United States government made a morally compromised decision under the pressure of the Cold War. What it tells us is something harder to process, that institutions are capable of looking directly at evidence of atrocity, weighing it against strategic interest, and choosing the interest. Calmly, methodically, with full documentation, and then filing that documentation somewhere it will take decades for anyone to find. The moon landing happened. The rockets worked. The science was real. The men who built those rockets had other histories too. Those histories existed in files. The files existed in archives. The archives were opened slowly, reluctantly, over decades, in response to pressure from journalists, investigators, and historians who refused to let the paperclip hold forever. And some of them still hold.